Hi, everyone, and welcome to Bible study. So, after a couple weeks off, we're going to be spending some time talking about the different promises that we see in the Bible, the promises that God makes to God's people. And we'll spend the next several weeks taking a look at this and talking about this kind of stuff. And this week, we're going to be taking a look at one of the promises that God makes to Abraham in the book of Genesis. And this is a promise for us about the promise of how God promises a future for us, how God promises to be there and to be present with us, how God knows what will be happening in the future and what will be happening in our lives. And so we'll be taking a look at Genesis chapter 17, and we're going to be looking at verses 15 to 17. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarah, your wife, you should not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him, and an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." So Abraham is one of those well-known stories in the Bible, one of the well-known characters in the Bible, and there's lots of interesting things that are happening here. And you can read throughout the middle of Genesis, leading up to chapters 18, 19, where it talks about God's relationship with Abraham. Abraham was a devout man. He was a very faithful man. Um, and he also had a difficult time conceiving a child with his wife. Um, and God appears, an angel appears to Abraham and tells Abraham that at some point he will conceive a child, but it doesn't happen, and Abraham loses his faith. You have to imagine that as Abraham is imagining a future with his life and his family, not having an heir in his family is a huge issue. And it must have been something that was weighing very deeply and heavily on his heart. Um, and so for Abraham, his promise of a future was something that he couldn't hold on to, that he couldn't see, that wasn't something that he was hoping for, he was hoping for, but didn't see that there was a reality for that to be able to come to fruition. And so he really struggled with that. And despite all of that, God comes to Abraham and says to Abraham that I am going to give you the opportunity to be a father, to have a child, and that your wife, Sarah, will have a child named Isaac. And Isaac will be the one that I will create my covenant with God's people. And you can hear in the story how Abraham responds to that. He sort of laughs at God and he says, "How is this possible? I'm over 100 years old, and how would it be possible that we would be able to have a child?" And Sarah is 90 some years old, and God says, "Well, this is what's going to happen." And for me, when I look at this Bible passage, it reminds me of the importance that um, we all have future hope and expectations. We all have things that we're looking forward to. We all um, have an expectation of what our future is going to look like. But our future and God's future doesn't always necessarily come together. And so I thought what we could do is just spend some time reflecting on this passage. And I have a few questions for you just to reflect on. The first is, if you were Abraham, how might you have responded to God's promise that he made? The second one is, what does this story tell us about God's timeline? And the third one is, what does God's naming of Isaac tell us about God? spend some time and reflect on these questions, and reflect on this idea of how, in spite of our brokenness, despite um, everything that we can or can't do, that God still promises a continued life for each and every single one of us. That God promises to still be with us. And so spend some time and reflect on those questions. And I'd love to hear from you again later on this week as you're exploring the Bible and wrestling with this idea of God's promise of a future. Send me an email or make a comment on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks again so much for joining me for Bible study this week, and I will see you again next week.